Until the end of the First World War, it was rare for bodies and remains of fallen soldiers to be returned home. That's when the government finally allowed parents or family members the choice of leaving their son buried in France or bringing them home for burial. Now, part of that program was the return of the first official U.S. unknown soldier. This is his story, and the story of why he still rests on American and French soil. The First World War was one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, claiming millions of lives and leaving countless families devastated. In the aftermath, many soldiers remain unidentified, their bodies lost in the confusion of battle. As early as a year after the war had ended, a memorial was proposed to honor those unknowns. But it wasn't until December of 1920 that Congressman Hamilton Fish introduced a resolution to return a soldier already buried in France and rebury him in his homeland. Congress approved the resolution March 4th of 1921 and authorized money to construct a tomb in the plaza of the Memorial Amphitheater in Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, D.C. Until construction of the tomb that we know today began 7 years later, the unknown soldier would lie in a marble crypt, a crypt that would eventually serve as a base for that final tomb. Early in September of 1921, the War Department ordered a body of an unknown American soldier be selected and taken to Le Havre, France, for shipment back to the United States. 4 bodies were exhumed from 4 different French cemeteries. Each was examined to ensure that there were no clues to his identity. And then, after the bodies were prepared and placed in identical sealed caskets, they were trucked to Chalons-sur-Marne for the selection ceremony on the very next day, October 24th. At 3 in the afternoon, October 23rd, the trucks arrived at the Hôtel de Ville. The town hall was located inside. A large delegation of American and French civilians and military officials in rank and file formation joined with the town's residents to watch French soldiers carry the caskets into the City Hall chapel. Early the next morning, a French army band began playing in the courtyard as Sergeant Edward Younger was handed a bouquet of red and white roses. Younger was an infantry sergeant who had taken part in 4 major engagements during the war and was wounded twice, receiving the Purple Heart as well as the Distinguished Service Cross for Valor. For his service, he was given the honor of selecting the final unknown soldier. Everyone had been asked to leave the chapel before Younger began walking through a line of French troops and into the room. There, he found 4 caskets all covered in American flags and an additional casket that would hold the selected unknown soldier. He walked around the coffins 3 times and then placed the roses on the casket facing the entrance to the room. In preparation for his long journey back to America, the casket was taken to a nearby room and the remains transferred to the special unknown soldier casket. For 3 hours, French citizens under the watchful eye of a guard of honor, consisting of 6 French soldiers and 6 Americans, were able to walk past the casket and pay their respects. Then, in the late afternoon, after a brief ceremony hosted by the town mayor, the unknown was placed on a gun carriage and escorted by town residents and French and American soldiers to the train station. The decorated funeral train left the station just after 6 that evening and arrived in Paris 4 hours later for an overnight stay. The next morning, October 25th, the train left Paris at exactly 9:20 and arrived in the port city of Le Havre at 1 that afternoon. The unknown was met by representatives of the American and French governments, an American honor guard, and a large group of French army troops who would escort the casket. They followed behind the American soldiers who, acting as pallbearers, carried the casket from the train to the square in front of City Hall, where the funeral caisson, draped in American flags, was waiting. Almost every resident of Le Havre had paid homage to the unknown by lining both sides of the street as the caisson began its march to the harbor. The accompanying cortege included French soldiers and sailors and a mass of American soldiers marching ahead of the casket. The 8-man honor guard on each side of that coffin were American sergeants, and among them, Edward Younger, the soldier who had selected the unknown. A French band led the escorts through the crowds that lined the streets. Most were waving American and French flags. The Le Havre school children showered the casket with flowers. There was a brief stop at City Hall, where members of the town council presented a wreath in honor of the unknown soldier. Then the procession continued on to the docks, where the U.S. cruiser Olympic waited to carry the unknown soldier home. At the docks, the cortege stopped, and a brief ceremony presented the unknown with the Cavalier of the Legion of Honor and attached it to the casket. The American pallbearers lifted the unknown and carried him toward the American cruiser. Upon reaching the gangplank, the casket was taken over by American Navy men. As they began up the gangplank, the onboard American band played the Marseillaise and the Star-Spangled Banner. The casket, decorated with wreaths and flowers, was placed on the lower deck of the ship to protect it from the weather. And as the Olympia moved away from the pier and steamed out into the bay, a salute of 17 guns erupted from a French destroyer. The unknown of all unknowns was finally heading home. It was raining November 9th as the Olympia sailed up the Potomac River and docked at the Washington Naval Yard. A bugler called for attention as a detail of Marines and sailors lifted the casket and carried it down the gangplank to the sounds of a boatswain's whistle and the ship's band playing Chopin's Funeral March. The unknown was placed upon the caisson, and the procession began its march to the Capitol, with the Army Cavalry Band playing Onward Christian Soldiers. At the Capitol, the unknown was carried up to the rotunda and placed on the very same platform that had held Lincoln's body after his assassination. Before the public was allowed in for the viewing, President Harding and his wife paid their respects. There were others, too, including General Pershing, who offered a floral tribute and saluted the casket. The next morning, November 10th, the public that had been waiting patiently in long lines were finally allowed to view the unknown. The line was so long that the viewing hours had to be extended to midnight. Over 90,000 people had walked by and paid their respects. Early on November 11th, the procession of military, dignitaries, and 44 other organizations had formed near the Capitol steps as the unknown was brought down to the waiting caisson. The long cortege began the march to Arlington National Cemetery. President Harding walked behind the caisson with General Pershing on his left. He would not walk the entire way, but was eventually taken to the cemetery by car. Former President Wilson was ill, and his carriage followed. Nearly 3 hours after its start, the procession reached the Memorial Amphitheater, where the unknown was carried inside and placed under the domed area for the official funeral. The 5,000 who had been admitted to the amphitheater took their seats to hear the president speak, while thousands listened outside. There was no national radio network in 1921. However, the cemetery was carried over telephone lines to cities as far away as San Francisco, where it was broadcast over speakers in the city's civic auditorium. When he finished, he attached the Congressional Medal of Honor and the Distinguished Service Cross to the unknown's casket. The service and ceremony over, the crowd followed the unknown to the burial site. The tomb we see today had not been completed yet. The simple, flat, marble tomb, placed over the grave of the unknown that day in 1921, would eventually serve as a base for the more, what they called, appropriate monument. Not until July 3, 1926, did Congress finally authorize $50,000 for the completion of the new tomb. It was completed and unveiled to the public on April 9th of 1932. The unknown still lies on French soil. Carried along with his body on his Olympic journey was a box filled with soil taken from the Chalons American Cemetery in France. The earth was spread on the cement floor of that original tomb just before his burial in 1921. He rests in honored glory, an American soldier known but to God. Thanks for watching. Hey, we'll see you real soon with something brand new. Now don't forget to subscribe and maybe give us a thumbs up. Have a great day and an even better tomorrow.